So the brown bag that we're going to cover today is on RBAC. RBAC is one of those things that can easily be neglected at a lot of implementations, and initially you won't really notice any problems, right? It's one of those things that will kind of creep up and just start causing problems in the future. There are customers out there that haven't pushed ACLs in months, maybe years, and then there's just other customers where they have all these objects and all these different permissions on them, and it just becomes a big kind of hairball mess that's really a pain to troubleshoot and deal with. So, the purpose of this is to kind of, start clarifying things, just kind of, getting the discussion going around RBAC, presenting some things, some concepts that I've been trying to teach in some of my classes, and just kind of open it up for any questions. So feel free we'll have a question time at the end of this, but feel free to interrupt if there's anything kind of, major while we're on topic that you want to talk about. So, all right. So this is a diagram that I recently put together, which kind of discusses the overall model of RBAC. This is everything you'll see kind of in the RBAC Manager workspace and all the objects and how they relate to each other. Go ahead.
The live meeting is not updating. At least not I'm the only one.
Do you guys see a slide that says overall model?
Yeah, but it's mostly white.
Yeah. It's an animation, so I'll start going through it, right? So what we have on one end is a person, right? And then what we have on the other end is a server. And this person wants to get access to the server. And what's in between is RBAC, right? So we have these two walls here. And the kind of gate into, getting access to a server is, from a user is a role, right? So when you first log into the GUI, you have to assume some role, right? The role says what you can and what you can't do, and it's just kind of the potential of, what your role has the ability to do, pending the objects in the system. So at the root level of all RBAC, we have these things called authorizations. And it's something really simple like, deploy job.execute or server.browse or, user.read or something like that. Every object has an associated authorization with it. And we have these things called authorization profiles, which, we get a lot of sample ones when we run deal content, but they're really kind of the best practice for just managing RBAC in your environment. You really want to manage things through authorization profiles. If you're tying individual authorizations to objects and roles, it's just one thing that can lead to a really messy environment. So the more you can kind of work with authorization profiles, the more sane, you'll be, as far as the ongoing management of your RBAC. And authorization profiles, you want to kind of model around the tasks. Things like, browsing servers or, doing Windows patching or, executing jobs. And a role is really, that you want to model around a specific job title at an organization. So, someone like a Windows administrator or someone, like a security admin. So authorization profiles, we add directly to roles. Now we have these other things called commands. So like NExec commands, we can add commands directly to roles as well. And we can also add authorizations to roles too. But, best practice for, like 99% of your implementations, you're not going to have to add commands to roles. And even in general, it's not a good practice to add authorizations to roles either. So while you can do it, doesn't always mean that you should. We also have these things called ACL templates. So an ACL template is really just a collection of authorizations, and also, roles. So it's really the kind of merge of a role and an authorization. So it's specific authorizations tied to individual roles. In ACL templates, we can also assign to roles. So we do that when we want specific permissions to be assigned to objects. Whenever users in a role create those objects. So, if we always want, the security admins to see the jobs that the Windows admins are creating, we can create an ACL template that has the permissions for those security admins and assign it to the Windows admin's role. And then whenever the Windows admins create those objects, they get the permissions that come from the ACL template. It's more of kind of an additive. So, the role that's creating an object always gets the maximum permissions that their role has access to. And an ACL template just kind of adds to those permissions. Now, roles, as far as this, user getting access to the server on the right-hand side, roles, and their authorizations, those get tied directly to server objects. So, and same goes with an ACL template. ACL templates we can apply to server objects, and also all other objects in Blade Logic to essentially grant a user access to a actual server. Now, the other piece of RBAC that we have here is an ACL policy. So an ACL policy is, again, a grouping of authorizations, role-specific authorizations that we can tie to individual objects. So with an ACL policy, we can add individual authorizations, specific to roles. We can also add authorization profiles to ACL policies, but the only problem is when you do that, the authorization profile is expanded, and inevitably only the authorizations are added to the policy. I think we have an enhancement request in to have the ability to keep authorization profiles persistent to ACL policies, but as far as 8.1 goes, you can only have authorizations within an ACL policy. In ACL policies, we can tie directly to server objects, and we can tie to any other object in the GUI, anything that you want to be assigning permissions to. We'll talk about best practices for ACL policies in a couple slides from this one. And then the other thing to note about ACL policies is that we can assign a window to them. So we can say only during this specific time should this ACL policy, meaning these permissions, apply to the objects that were, that policy is tied to. So again, as far as best practices go, you don't want to start adding authorizations directly to ACL templates. Typically, there are always going to be cases when you will want to, but best practice, you want to keep your authorization profiles at the central place where you're managing your authorizations. Okay. Now, to talk a little bit just kind of about the overall model from a very basic perspective. So we have our user and we have our server on the right over there. They're logging into a role. That role gets access to objects. Those objects can include server objects. And the server object goes through essentially the agent ACLs to inevitably get, allow or deny access to the actual server for that change to take place. So to talk a little bit about, just kind of general analogy specific to ACL policies. So if you think about how authorization profiles are tied to roles, it's really the same as how ACL policies are tied to objects. Okay, so you're managing all of your groups of authorizations. So authorizations are groups of authorization profiles are groups of authorizations which get assigned to roles, and you're just kind of managing the authorizations within the authorization profile. It's the same way an ACL policy gets tied to an object, right? So an ACL policy just being, basically a collection of those individual authorizations. As soon as you update the ACL policy, the objects that they're tied to get updated as well. So, same with an authorization profile. As soon as you update the authorizations in that authorization profile, the roles that that authorization profile is tied to, those authorizations immediately take effect as soon as you save the authorization profile. And again, the same way you can have multiple authorization profiles in a role, you can also have multiple ACL policies within an object. So, just kind of an analogy to get your head around the whole system. To talk a little bit more about authorization profiles versus an individual authorization, authorization profiles should be modeled around things like tasks, right? So browsing servers or auditing servers or, patching a server. So, essentially, we have a bunch of examples that come out of DL content, but in general, when you're talking about specific tasks that you perform on a server, typically, that's exactly how you would model your authorization profiles. So if, the blade logic permissions associated with that task ever change, you're just modifying the authorization profile, and you don't have to go to all of the roles that specific task applies to. You just update the one authorization profile. So, again, roles, they should have, and they most likely will have, multiple authorization profiles, depending on all the tasks for that specific role or, essentially job title at the customer. And essentially, it becomes self-documenting, so you can open up the role, and by browsing the names of the authorization profiles, you can see exactly what, the major tasks that role is assigned to or responsible for. So, again, it's a lot easier to create, and update one-off profile than to have to go to all of the roles that specific task may apply to. So, ACL templates, they have multiple purposes. So, in general, it's just a set of default permissions that are assigned to a specific role. So, with an authorization profile, it's just authorization and an authorization type. An ACL template is an authorization and an authorization type, such as server.browse, but tied to a specific role. So, it could be Windows admins, server.browse, or Unix admins, patch deploy. So, essentially, we can apply them, and we can use these ACL templates in a few different purposes. So, if we can tie ACL templates to roles, like I was mentioning before, to define these default permissions when a user in that role creates those objects. Instead of having to remember every single time you create an object, what permissions to apply, you can have them applied to by default. And we can also use ACL templates for setting permissions to objects in bulk. So in the GUI, I could say control-click on a series of objects, or right-click on the top-level folder, update the permissions, and then choose the ACL template to then recursively apply all the permissions or apply all those permissions in bulk to the objects that I want to update. And this is kind of where there's like this gray area of should I be applying the ACL template, or should I be assigning and creating an ACL policy? And then one final purpose of ACL templates is for handing off objects from one role to another. So in an application release management scenario where you have developers handing off applications that they're building to people to QA, you don't really want the QA people making modifications to what the job that or what the package that the developers created. You really just want them to test the package deployment and maybe control some parameters, such as like a directory or something. But you really just want them to deploy the package to a different set of targets and report the results back. You don't want them fiddling with the package. Well, you could use an ACL template to say, remove the current roles permissions. You don't want the developers messing with the package while the QA people are actually testing it. You want to lock them out of it. So you could say, apply the ACL template that gives the current role read permissions and then gives the QA role the ability to execute and test this job on their server that they have access to. So as far as the policy versus the templates, they both allow you to change ACLs on objects, right? So, and many times, just kind of managing blade logic, you're constantly kind of adjusting permissions and objects depending on, the varying needs of the end users in the environment. So the ACL template lets you do it one time, right? So if I want to update the permissions on this one object or multiple objects, I just browse to my ACL template, apply it, and it's done. There's no kind of persistence there. But with a policy, the policy becomes tied to the object. And you can actually go to it and you can see the object, you can see the policy that it's applied to. And then as soon as you update that policy, all of the objects that that policy is associated with receive those new permissions. But one thing to keep in mind is that there's no inheritance with an ACL policy. So just because there might be an ACL policy in a folder doesn't mean that ACL policy is going to apply to all the objects within that folder. So, as you kind of get your head around this whole system, you can see how, the complexity of this whole situation.
I'm actually on a logic.
So as you can see, with all of the different elements to RBAC in the system, you can see how the complexity can get, really high. So, which is why it's truly important to kind of lay out and design RBAC and teach your customers RBAC and make them self-sufficient before you leave. So as far as what's more useful, so they really just have their own advantages, right? So, policies, they have some performance hit currently in 8.1. So, if you have a bunch of objects and a lot of policies, you may notice a performance hit in the GUI. Changing policies or applying an ACL template, can sometimes be the same amount of work if that policy isn't already predefined on the objects that you want to create. So it does take some foresight with policies to know, what are all the objects that should be a part of this policy. And you may not know that when you're first building out the system. So you want to be careful in defining your policies before you just start going and assigning them to every object that you have in the GUI. And in general, policies can be dangerous just because it affects all of the objects that are tied to the policy, but also all the objects that might be related to the policy. So you could have a package and a job, and the policy really may only be tied to the package and not the job. So if you change the policy in such where it affects the other people's ability to deploy that job, you essentially could be breaking the deploy job simply by changing the policy which is tied to the object. So it basically can be pretty complex, and you want to kind of think it out when you're building and working with ACL policies. So as far as just general best practices, like I was saying before, stay away from commands and adding commands to roles. As soon as you add a single command to a role, you're limiting that role to that specific command or those specific commands that you added. So, best practice, just stay away. I think this is, really meant more for customers that have end users that strictly use network shell. But, most customers, most of the people who have that customer are using the GUI, and you don't get it to the point where you need to start limiting users to specific commands. Another big one is run an RBAC workshop with your customer. Every single customer should have a very deep understanding of RBAC and all of the kind of complexities, so you don't end up with these and that situations down the road. It's boring. It can take a lot of time, but in the end, it'll save them a lot of time, and it'll also give them the ability to control access to the system in exactly the manner that they want to give their end users. And that's really what the goal is. So with Blade Logic, of course, you have the power of automation, but with that power comes responsibility and also a lot of danger as well. So if you're not kind of locking down specific users to, really what they should be doing and only what they should be doing, you could potentially set yourself up for a very dangerous situation, or even something that really drastic situation in the future where somebody did something that they really shouldn't have. So other best practices, just in general, make your workspaces neat, make them organized. Don't give every role the ability to write to the top level folder. Create a workspace structure, with every user within their role-specific folder. Give every user their sandbox, a place where every user can create their own objects. But then define a system where they can promote objects to a top-level folder where end users know, okay, if I want to do patching, here are all the approved kind of production patching jobs. Same thing with application deployment or provisioning. So it's going to come back, as far as RBAC and object permission maintenance goes. If you have a very organized and structured workspace, it can be a lot easier to update the permissions on those objects in the future. So, it's all about really just kind of laying down a solid foundation, keeping it simple, keeping it organized, and just really preparing the customer for growth and not dealing with very messy situations in the future. So another thing, I find that a lot of people get into this habit of using deal admins. You go to customers and they have a bunch of people logging in. Everyone's using deal admins, and everyone's a member of RBAC admin. For small customers, that may be fine, but in general, don't use deal admins beyond just the initial environment setup or kind of ongoing environment maintenance, such as doing things like the ACL push or doing things like update server properties. Deal admins should really just be there for kind of troubleshooting and then running environment-wide maintenance jobs on a schedule. But for day-to-day activity, everyone should have a role defined for the specific job title at that customer. As far as ACL policies go, they're still a relatively new thing. I don't think we've defined any true best practices for them. But, again, they're great for updating many object permissions at once. But there are cases when you may not know, when you're first building out your Blade Logic environment, what are all the objects that I'm going to have to update at once in the future? You may not know that. So, you just basically use caution and don't set yourself up where, you're kind of troubleshooting all of these different objects that have a policy and have additional permissions and so forth. So be very strategic with how you define your ACL policies. I find that they're probably best used as far as, around specific use cases. So if you think about patching, patching involves a lot of different objects. You have the patch catalog, you have the patch, payload, you have the patch job, the multiple patch jobs such as analysis and deployment, and the server that you're deploying your patches to. Theoretically, if you had a patching ACL policy, any one that you wanted to give the ability to do patching to. So if you had, say, like a new role or, I guess essentially a new role that you wanted to grant the access to do patching, and you already had a, large patching system set up with a patching ACL policy tied to all the related objects. Well, instead of having to go to each of those individual objects to grant patching access to this new role, you could just go to your patching ACL policy and give the patching ability to this new role that you defined. So, I think I may, once we kind of open up for questions, ask people what they do as far as, ACL policies that customers currently pay. That's one thing I think we haven't really defined true best practices for yet. In general, just kind of feel out the customer's requirements before you're implementing them. And, one signal that you're definitely going to need ACL policies for. So if you're talking with a customer and they're saying, well, we have these, outage windows or change windows, that to you should signify, okay, we definitely have to create some ACL policies. So ACL policies, if you have any sort of outage windows or change windows, that's where you would implement an ACL policy. So as I was mentioning, about doing an RBAC workshop at every customer, you really should be doing this at every customer. In general, make sure the customers understand the foundation. So, if you do have this bad, foundation, you're just going to end up with a long-term pain. We have a dedicated page on Norris with all the information you could ever want to know and need to deliver an RBAC workshop. So we have the presentation, we have just general guidelines, we have questions, and we have a spreadsheet for you to fill out with the customer to start defining those actual roles that they're going to be creating the initial part of their implementation. And that should be the output that kind of gets you started down the path of defining RBAC in their environment. So, finally, the biggest lessons really about RBAC is that it's really important. If not implemented correctly, it can just cause a lot of pain in the future, and it's constantly evolving. So I think a lot of customers, you start talking to them and they start thinking like, a year down the road, 2 years down the road, and they start defining this like massive RBAC system and all this workflow. Try to keep it focused and keep it simple, and just explain to them like, look, let's just build, the roles for the first the first 2 or 3 roles that we're going to need. Let's get them implemented. Let's teach you how the system works, and then as we start adding more users into the system, then we can start building out the environment more. So, kind of teach to them, look, it's constantly going to be evolving first of all, as you learn the system and as their needs change and as they start, increasing their BladeLogic user base. So that was kind of really everything I wanted to say today about RBAC. So I don't know, Bill, if you wanted to kind of jump in and add anything to that.
No, that's pretty good.
Thanks. I think it was a lot of talking, but hopefully some point stuck.
Hey,
so sorry, what were you saying? Go ahead.
Hey, Greg, this is John O'Toole in support. Hi.
Hey, John.
Hey, I just want to bring up one point for an issue I actually encountered recently, and I guess it's been known for a little while, but I myself had not encountered it much. And there's an issue around ACL policies with BSA, BDSA. Are you familiar with that?
No.
Yeah, there's basically an issue where BSA kind of ignores the permissions granted through ACL policies. So basically, if you've got a role called a Unix admins, and that role has access on a job or a server via an ACL policy, when you log into BDSA as that role, Unix admins, you don't actually see the object. And that's going to be fixed in BDSA 81ST3, which is going to be like the August-September time frame. But it's a pretty big thing if you're using ACL policies. So something maybe another reason. Bill Robinson, you're aware of this issue, right? Or are you?
Yeah, I've heard about that. Yeah.
Yeah. So just like you, I kind of heard about it until I encountered it first time the other night. So it might be a kind of a reason to, if you're going to the site that uses BDSA heavily, to maybe resist using ACL policies for a little while, possibly. Because the workaround is to assign the permissions, directly, not via an ACL policy. But I just wanted to bring that up.
Cool. So in regards to ACL policies, what are some of the types of ACL policies that people are implementing? I mean, have people been running into problems implementing them, or implementing them and realizing they implemented them the wrong way? Are there any kind of best practice guidelines that people have learned in using them?
I don't know if that's for the field, but from a support point of view, this BDSA ticket makes me think that not many of them are using them yet, because only 3 customers reported the BDSA issue with ACL policies. So, whereas anybody using ACL policies would probably fit it with BDSA, which makes me think not many are using it.
Hey guys, this is Amit there. So I know that Liberty Mutual is using ACL policies very, very heavily. I mean, they are one customer who probably reported a lot of performance issues on that as well. And I know that Bank of America wasn't using it earlier, but they have started playing around with it in their dev environment, and they are starting to use it now. Also, regarding the ACL policy performance issues that you mentioned in your presentation, so some of them were resolved in 8.1, but there are still some, like I know one of them, which is if you click on Show Dependency View for ACL policies, it's on Liberty Mutual database, it's not going to come up even in 1 hour. And I've never seen that working. And there is a huge user story that was created against it that is actually scheduled not before 8.5 release or so. So it's pretty late that way, and it is an issue. But I was just curious in terms of what other types of ACL policy performance issues have you seen out there? Because I know that you had that in the slide, but the details were not there.
Yeah, so I think the other thing I mean, some of this stuff is kind of in flux because it's being addressed. So I know this has been an issue in 8.0. I don't know how much of this is fixed in 8.1. I mean, we can certainly kind of track that stuff down, but there had been an issue with live browse and ACL policy where that seemed to cause some issues when you were browsing through the server tree if your objects had multiple ACL policies applied to it. Because it's trying to resolve the permissions on those objects, as you're browsing through like a server tree or the job tree or something like that. I think there was another issue. I think I mentioned it in there. Not necessarily performance, but it was in 8.0 at least, it was difficult to, you couldn't really tell what the actual permissions were on the object by looking at it. So like if you looked in that permissions tab in the GUI, it would just show the ACL policy. It wouldn't show, what the actual effective ACLs were.
Just to add on to that, so that particular problem is resolved in 8.1, and I want to say completely resolved in 8.2, because what we did in 8.1 is we added something called as ACL summary view. So when you go to that, it shows you the object ACL, and it shows you all the permissions that are coming from which ACL policy, and if you have maintenance windows, then the permissions that are coming from which ACL policy and maintenance windows. And you can also use the time filter to see whether the maintenance window will be valid during that time or not. But it only took into consideration the object ACL, whereas as you described in your presentation, the real permissions are intersection of row-level permissions and object ACL. So in 8.2, we are enhancing that view to also provide customers with effective permissions view. So there we will, so if the role does not have access at the role level, but it is getting access on a particular object through the ACL policy at object ACL level, we will still not show that, because in reality during runtime, that role will not have access on that object. But in 8.1, the ACL summary view at least shows you which permissions are coming from the ACL policies. It still isn't completely the actual effective permissions during runtime. So what are so live browse I wasn't aware of. I knew that there were problems with editing ACL policies on Liberty Mutual DB. Essentially, I mean, it was just taking a long time there, and that problem has been resolved in 8.2 now. There were some service packs and some hotfixes provided to them specifically, but that problem has completely been resolved in 8.2. We are also resolving some performance issues around authorization profiles. So, but that will also be in 8.2. So I definitely want to add that that using authorization profiles on roles can also slow things down today, like and even in 8.1. But that is also being looked upon in 8.2, and hopefully after 8.2 that will also become much faster. So the other thing is, for the RBAC use cases, I was interested particularly to know that do most of our customers use the concept of, let's say, admin user and operator user, in the sense that admin user will create and will assign permissions for the operator to execute jobs. The admin user will be the one creating all the content, and the operator user will be the one executing the jobs and just debugging them, sort of. Is that the most common use case?
So, I mean, I think it can vary a lot, but I think that's a very common setup, so where you have people defining objects and then people executing. But it really does that. It varies so much from customer to customer, and then how big the adoption level is of WebLogic, and how big the end user base is.
Okay.
But yeah, Bill, I don't know if you had anything else, or if anyone had any questions on the model that you see here, or the other best practices that I brought up.
Yeah, I mean, not really. I think one thing that would be helpful, we have those sample roles, the sample authorization profiles that get created. I think it would be great if we had, if that was a little more complete. I think, because I think it would make it easier for people to build out, the roles and such with some kind of plain English like profile. So like browse server, audit server, snapshot server, that kind of stuff. I think the default ones are a start, but I think it would make it easier to have a standardized sort of implementation with that. Because I think a lot of customers actually struggle with, they start applying ACLs and they put things in directly, and it's just like into the role, and then they got to go change things, and it just is very complicated to manage. But I think. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, in regards to the sample content, I think it's almost best to when you do, after you do run it and you're working with the customer to start building out their specific roles and authorization profiles, is to just take copies of those roles and copies of anything sample, so that the sample kind of remains preserved and you can always use it as a reference. But then, whenever you're creating something new with the customer, don't just rename the sample stuff. Take an actual copy so that you kind of have, the customer-specific implementation of that, and you're not just kind of blindly using the sample stuff.
Hi, Greg. It's Stuart here. I think if I understood what the other guy was saying, it'd be handy if when we run the BL content, if that would add more sample authorization profiles in, because quite often when you're building your own authorization profiles with the client, they can see what a complete how difficult it can be, and it's off-putting. So I agree with the guy. I didn't get his name, but I mean maybe when you run BL content, if that could populate the console with more authorization profiles, it might alleviate some of the pain that's involved in creating them yourself.
Yeah, no, there's no reason why we can't just submit a ticket and say, here's an example authorization profile that I'm constantly creating, at all my customers. So I think it would be relatively easy to add to a future release, but we just need to kind of do our part and help define what those sample authorization profiles or roles should be included with BL content. It's not a script, so we can't just kind of go in and edit it and then share it with the rest of the field. It is actually part of the install to binary. So if we're gonna want to get that improved, then the best thing is to just submit a ticket.
Okay, cheers.
And I would think that would be a pretty quick thing to be approved.
Yeah, this is Amit again, and I absolutely agree. You should submit a ticket. Also, if you want, you can email me and I can bring it within engineering as well as with the PM as well, so that we can address that. I don't want to make any promises because at this point we are still trying to figure out how to enhance BL content overall. But my email address is amit_gupta3@bmc.com. So you can absolutely send me an email and I'll try to bring it up with the product management.
Cool. Cheers.
Yeah, it's Paul here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Good. I just had a quick question on this because I don't know whether the BL content has been updated since the early 8.0 SP1 experience, but what I found was that we had a lot of problems with the authorization profiles in there not actually being correct and even misleading, so that when you try to actually make use of those two things, we had to correct them. And I know that things change a lot between 7.6 and 8.0, and I do believe the BL content was upgraded at some stage, but has that all been fixed in 8.1? Are all the BL content, particularly the authorization profiles where we had problems? The roles were fine, but is that being kept up to date?
So that's something I can't answer. I don't know if anybody else is aware.
We did not make any updates to BL content as far as I know. And since I don't know of us making any, I doubt it happens.
Yeah, I don't think there are any there aren't any actual policies in there. I think it's just the profile, and I think in 8.0 the cache catalogs were added to it, but that was about it. It's just the smart groups that are in there for the servers. The conditions on them are very outdated. I mean, there's stuff for Red Hat 7 and Red Hat 9 or something still in there, and some of the we should add in filters for newer versions of the OSs. So there's a lot of stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, the way that we're trying to take this now is to do it based on, and I'm seeing this in several cases, and I'd really like to see this done on a more sort of standardized approach, is that we're trying to always produce an RBAC spreadsheet which has got the auth profiles, the the role to auth mappings, the roles, and the ACL templates. We haven't got it as far as working with ACL policies, although there's a possibility to do that, so that we have an Excel spreadsheet, and then we've got a bunch of Perl scripts that actually produce the BLCLI to generate those. Because the other problem with the whole authorizations is that there's no easy way to export and re-import any of the RBAC side of it. And personally, I think that the BL content also puts too many authorization profiles in there. So are there any moves to try and standardize something along these lines, either from the BU itself or from the consulting services organization?
So nothing that I'm aware of. I'm not sure if anybody else is. Yeah, I mean, I think it's really up to us to define these standards. I mean, you know, I think just kind of having standard templates to use in things like an RBAC workshop is a good start. But, you know, until we start, like, you know, blowing them out at every customer and kind of, you know, sharing them with the rest of the field, then, you know, we're going to need to do that if we're going to start, like, getting these standards to kind of bubble up to the top.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to share what I've got. At the moment, of course, the problem I have is that some of it's customer specific, so I can't put it in its current form onto Norris. So I'm not quite sure what the best way to share those is.
So is it just, like, what part, like, what is it, a spreadsheet or something?
Well, I mean, there's a spreadsheet. I mean, the Perl scripts I'm quite happy to share because that's all generic stuff.
Yeah.
But, I mean, I have put an earlier sanitized version of the spreadsheet on Norris under the RBAC section. But, I mean, as you say, I think it would actually be useful to share, you know, what people have actually done for different projects. Because there are obviously different requirements depending on the type of project we're doing, and service providers tend to be more painful than others, and different projects have different requirements. So having a sort of, if you like, a library of RBAC spreadsheets would be really useful so that people can actually see what's been used on different projects and then just pull something out that they think most closely matches what they've done.
Yeah, I think whatever you have as an example, as long as you just remove the customer name, then, you know, I mean, I don't know if it's as easy as assign or replace, but, you know, any sort of examples would be a great start.
Yeah, okay. I mean, I'll put what I've got, and I think it would be really useful to have some kind of discussions around this, and I don't know whether we do this on the developer network because, as I say, having my experience has indicated that I started by putting too many authorization profiles in there. Mm-hmm. And so the number gets smaller when I do the next one, so it'd be just good to have a discussion around this.
Yeah, I mean, anytime you have, like, you know, a topic you want to discuss or just general best practices, then, you know, best bet is just use one of our online tools to kind of put it out there and see what people are saying. So, does anyone have any other comments or questions or just general feedback around what we talked about today?
No, it's been very interesting, though.
All right. I'm going to put up these slides to Norris in the next day or so. I'll probably get this diagram up there and, you know, just put the best practices right on the RBAC page. But yeah, you know, I think in general it should be kind of an ongoing discussion as we all kind of learn our best practice experiences out in the field. And, you know, the biggest lesson I think is, you know, it's tricky, it's tough, but it's important. So, cool. All right. Well, if there's any other feedback, feel free to email or reach out. And thanks everyone for your time.
All right.
Cool. Cheers, Greg.
Thank you so much.